So here's my video on the easiest way to get a work permit in Canada. Now, before I dive into what permits are, who needs them, and the different kinds of work permits, just let it be known that you can't just come to Canada because you want to work. You have to get a work permit through our immigration system, which is a completely different story than just having a desire to come to Canada to work. So many people I deal with, they just want to show up at the border and say, how do I get a work permit? And it does not work like that at all. So let's get into the types of work permits and then see what are the easier ones within all the different types of work permits you can get in Canada. So basically, work permits are separated into two broad categories. There's what are called open work permits, and there's closed work permits. Now, as you might guess, open work permits are permits where it doesn't matter where you work in Canada or who you work for or what job you do. You are allowed to work. As an open work permit holder, you can work in any occupation, any job, and any position in any part of the country. Now, compare that to a closed work permit, which is, as you've guessed it, is only for a specific employer for a specific location and a specific job. Okay. Now, the majority of work permits out there are probably closed work permits when you actually look at the numbers, and that's the way it's going to be going in the future. We had open work permits available for certain people in Canada, but that number of people is now shrinking. So a good example of an open work permit would be called a postgraduate work permit. And this is when you come to Canada to study at like the bachelor or master's level. And then afterwards, you can apply for a work permit. That's just sort of the benefit of getting a study program completed in Canada. You get to apply for a work permit afterwards. A lot of people do the study program just so they can get access to the open work permit that they get afterwards. So in other words, studying in Canada leads you to a work permit, and the work permit will eventually lead you to opportunity for permanent residency. And that's how the system basically works. If you're looking at why would someone study, well, to get a work permit, why do they need a work permit? Oh, so they can get work experience so they can immigrate permanently. So getting the open work permit, you have to be eligible, right? You can't just get one because you want one. So the postgraduate work permit is a good example of a very common open work permit. There are probably more open work permit holders who are postgraduate work permits than any other type of open work permit out there. Because basically every international student at the post-secondary level is eligible in the most part for these open work permits. So there's the one way, how to get the easiest work permit might be the open one available as a postgraduate work permit holder. Now let's look at the second major category would be open work permits in the spousal section. So this is people who are spouses of students or spouses of other people who have work permits. And, up until recently, anyone that was a spouse of a student basically got a work permit. And then we've changed that recently to basically you have to be the spouse of a student studying at the master's level or the PhD level in order to get a work permit. So this now totally, changes the number of open work permit holders that we have in the spousal category. And the spousal category, for open work permit holders is beneficial for a family that's going to immigrate to Canada. Because if you think about it, to get that open work permit as a spouse, your spouse has to be studying in a post-secondary school at the master's or the PhD level. So they're stuck studying. They're not going to be working. They're going to be in their study permit. But because they're studying, you as the spouse get to have an open work permit. So as long as they study, you get the open work permit. They are tied to one another. In other words, like if she stops studying or they stop studying, then you don't get a work permit anymore. And the government of Canada used to issue the work permits on their own merits and be like, okay, well, even if your wife stops studying, you can keep working. But now they're changing this again. They're basically making new rules they're not out yet, but they're going to, basically state that they're allowed to revoke permits they've already issued, and this is going to apply to that broad category of spousal open work permit holders who already have work permits, but maybe their spouse is no longer studying and now they're no longer officially eligible. So the government might, rescind that work permit. So back to my point here. So getting a work permit as a spouse of a student is beneficial because it'll allow you to get the work experience, or in some cases, work experience plus a job offer, to then apply for permanent residency, which is the whole goal, right? You wouldn't come here and spend a bunch of money on your study program if you didn't have the opportunity to get permanent residency afterwards. So the spouse sometimes can get a pathway to permanent residency even before the other spouse is graduated from their school. And this is a huge benefit to the family, because now you can, apply for permanent residency right away, and you don't have to even graduate your study program no longer if you don't want to, right? In some cases. So spousal open work permits, postgraduate work permits, those are both considered open work permits. There's one more major category. It's called the International Experience Canada Program, and they have a work permit called the Working Holiday Visa. This is an open work permit as well. And the only thing about this one is that you have to be from a participating IEC Canada country. And then you have to be under the age of 35 in most cases. So these permits usually hail from countries such as UK, France, Australia, Germany, New Zealand. Most European countries have an agreement with Canada to send youth to Canada, and Canada reciprocates by offering to send youth to their countries. So we both participate in these kind of youth mobility programs, they're called. Now, for a lot of people who are coming to Canada, they may be from countries that are not eligible for this type of work permit. So you are at a disadvantage, totally. But if you're asking me what's the easiest type of work permit to get, well, when I look at the IEC program, International Experience Canada program, I look at the UK. The UK has a quota. Last year had a quota of 15,000. This year it's a quota of 9,000. There's 9,000 UK nationals that are going to be coming to Canada. And the only requirement is that you have to be under the age of 35 and have a UK passport. That's it. The application is very simple and straightforward. In Australia, they're not even providing a cap. They're basically offering unlimited IEC work permits for anyone from Australia coming over to Canada. This is a sneaky and unique way for Canada to attract young, skilled workers from these types of countries. Because again, remember, what's the point of getting a work permit is to get work experience that you would then use to apply for permanent residency, right? A lot of people spend a lot of money and time just to get the opportunity to get a work permit, and these people are just basically getting them for free. And that is the major advantage you have coming from those types of countries. So ironically, the US, our biggest, our second biggest source of immigration, basically, doesn't have a youth mobility program with us. So there's a lot of connections we have, with the US, but one of them is not the US, the youth mobility. So a lot of our young people that come to work in Canada are coming from foreign countries that are not, basically not the US. If you want to consider, France, Germany, UK, Australia, New Zealand, all those countries are big source countries for those IEC working holiday visas. And there's some South American ones as well. And there's a couple ones in Asia. So there's lots of opportunity out there for young people. If you're in the demographic of under the age of 35, then it's worth checking out definitely to see if you're eligible for one of those work permits. So that basically covers the open work permit, the major categories of the open work permits. There are other open work permits available. The spouse of a skilled worker, for example, or like, maybe you're a refugee claimant or something like this, or you have applied for permanent residency. There's another version of the open work permit. Spousal open work permit for a sponsorship application. But, those ones, basically, they're few and far between. And so the open work permits, you have to be kind of connected to another person who's either studying or working, basically, or you have to have graduated a program in Canada to get that open work permit, or you have to be in the benefit of having, coming from a country like the UK and being under the age of 35 for the IEC program. So now let's talk about all the other work permits, which are called closed work permits. These are the ones where the majority of people who are coming just kind of out of the blue to Canada would be getting, because they're all connected to employment offers from Canadian companies who require foreign workers to come in. And the major one that we have in the closed work permit space is the temporary foreign worker program. The temporary foreign worker program is basically in charge of making sure all of our labor shortages in Canada are met. Especially in like fields that we really need workers, like agriculture, for example. In agriculture, if we don't have the workers, we don't get the food, and we need the food to feed our population. So there's some sectors that are just prioritized, and one of them would be, farming, for example. There was during the pandemic, we prioritized truck drivers. We always prioritize healthcare workers, and tech workers to a certain degree. So if you're in these specific, silos of work and you get a job offer from a Canadian employer, often it's very smooth process to get a work permit because we're in a clear labor shortage for that position. So as long as they're going to treat you okay, they're going to pay you a fair wage, and they're going to, offer you a permanent position, then the process to get the work permit is pretty straightforward. You have to make an application, but you're exempted from a large amount of the red tape that's usually involved when you hire a foreign worker to come into Canada, just because these particular jobs are in such high demand. So that's not everybody though. Like obviously not everyone's going to be a butcher or a food, agricultural farm worker or a truck driver. So, for a large amount of people, when they're coming in to look for work permits for the first time, if they're not in the open work permit category, they're looking for the closed work permit options, then they're going to be needing a job offer. And then the Canadian employer has to do what's called a labor market test. They have to prove that they can't hire that position from a Canadian citizen or permanent resident already. So let's say, for example, you are, a bookkeeper. Okay. So you worked in an office as a bookkeeper and you want to immigrate to Canada. You realize that you just can't apply to permanent residence. You have to get a work permit first to get some work experience, to get some, points for your express entry profile. And so you look for a job opportunity, right? Maybe you even fly to Canada and visit Canada and you tour around, or you apply online, whatever you want to do. And employers are starting to get interested. Oh yeah, I'd hire you. Sure. What do we do? What's up? And they soon find out that they have to go through a pretty complex application to hire you. They can't just offer you the job and give you a work permit. They have to prove that they can't fill this position normally from their own population of existing workers in Canada. So as much as the temporary foreign worker program is in charge of filling the labor shortages, is also in charge of protecting our labor market. In fact, if you're not, if even one person or two people apply for the job that you're advertising, it's unlikely that you're going to get approved for this type of work permit anyway. So as an employer, if I can ask myself a very basic question, if I want to hire Susan from the UK as a bookkeeper, I have to ask myself, if I advertise a bookkeeper position right now in my local area, my province or my city, am I going to get suitable qualified applicants coming my way? So maybe in my world, I need someone that has 2 years experience as a bookkeeper, and they have to have like a post-secondary credential, 2 years post-secondary credential as a bookkeeper. So I make my little ad and I post it and I advertise for 30 days. I get a bunch of people applying. I notice that, most of them seem to be outside Canada. They don't seem to be Canadian citizens. I can ignore all those ones because that doesn't impact our labor market. But then I notice that 2 or 3 appear to be coming from Canada, appear to be meeting the qualifications that I've listed. So now I have to follow up. If I don't follow up, then I can't apply for the LMIA, the document that I need to hire my foreign worker and give them the work permit. So I follow up with these applicants and I interview them and everything. And now I have to come up with a reason why that I didn't hire them, right? And then we have to submit this information through a big complex application called a labor market impact assessment, otherwise known as an LMIA. And if it gets approved, only then can I then offer the work permit opportunity for the person I want to hire. And then they come in as a work permit holder, as a closed work permit. So that process is months. Like we're talking 6 months minimum for all that to happen. So by that time, who even knows if the job's still available, or if the person that wants it still wants it. So, like getting yourself into a work permit situation through that type of complex application is not a very likely story, unless you're in a very extreme, situation where the labor market really needs that type of position filled. So closed work permits, although they are more complex to get, they often are more secure because they give you a pathway in many cases to get the work experience that you need, right? With an open work permit, you're not even guaranteed a job offer, not even guaranteed, to get work experience. But on the closed work permit, all the job offer, all the, requirements for the job has already been met, and you just have to fulfill the contract or fulfill the term. So in that closed work permit space as well, there's also a subcategory of work permit holders who come from what are called international agreements. International agreements with the US, with UK, with Europe, with Asia, with South America. We have Canada goes out and we make agreements with all these different nations through these trade pacts. Well, one of the benefits of that is that you get to trade labor back and forth. So in some cases, like for example, from Colombia and Ecuador, Canada imports a lot of engineers and mechanical engineers and oil and gas engineers, right, for our oil and gas industry in Alberta. So if you have an engineering degree and you're from Colombia, you are exempt from that big complex process I went through earlier that has to do the labor market thing. So you can basically pre-apply and direct apply into a work permit situation. It's not going to be an open one. It's still going to be a closed one, but it's going to be a much smoother, easier process than going through the labor market test. And that's just because we have free trade agreements with these countries, right? And not many people know this, but we have, a whole list of occupations that are exempted from those complex LMIA versions of the applications if you have the credential to go with them. So if you're being offered an accountant position, you have to have a bachelor in, accounting. You cannot just say, I'm going to, get the batch or the accounting position and I have the experience that's needed. So the education requirement really matters. And then you have to be from that country that has the agreement with Canada. So this is a kind of a workaround that a lot of companies in Canada use to import labor in because they're in special niche markets. And so they basically target countries that have international agreements with us and to fill their labor needs. I'll use the example of Colombia again, because Colombia, is the perfect example for how we get engineers and, these types of skilled occupations into our oil and gas industry. We basically just target Ecuador and Colombia for these types of people. Chile has an agreement with us as well, and Peru. So it's an opportunity for people that are in those countries that have those credentials to come in and work directly. And then again, like if you're offered this position as, an engineer and you get a closed work permit, pretty easily get that work permit, by the way. Your spouse then, because you're a skilled worker, you're in this, category of considered skilled, your spouse then gets the work permit as well. Because remember, there's a rule if you're a spouse of a skilled worker, you get the open work permit as well. So that then opens the door for a whole family to come in. Maybe the kids come in and they get study permits, and then this acts as a stepping stone to a larger sort of pathway to permanent residency down the line. And all of this can be mapped out, before. You don't have to, in our world, when we advise people who are coming to Canada or employers who are hiring their foreign labor overseas and they want to know things like, can I bring my family? Well, when do we get to apply for permanent residency? We can work backwards from the date they're eligible for permanent residency and basically break down all the steps, based on the current conditions and the current pathways available to us, So, that's a very huge benefit if you're going to make that big leap to come into Canada. You want to know, hey, where do I stand in 5 years from now? Am I going to be a permanent resident? Am I going to just be, another worker again? Do I have to leave Canada at the end of the working term? All that stuff should be sort of approved and known before you even commit down that road, right? At least in my world, that's the way I like to do it. So these international agreements are huge. They're a large source of a lot of the workers that come in. One other one I want to talk about is called the intercompany transfer. So this is the one that, big companies, big multinational companies use to move their labor around the world. So take Microsoft, right? Microsoft has operations in a lot of countries. So when you're a multinational, you basically have one parent company that owns, subsidiaries in different countries. So if a company wants to open up a new branch in Canada, or if there's already an existing branch, they can move in labor right away. They don't have to do any labor market test application. They don't have to do any exemptions. They can just move in their skilled worker, their executives or their professionals right away. But the condition is you have to be already working at one of the parent companies or the subsidiary company of the parent company already to be shifted in. You can't just be someone off the street, right? So this also applies to business owners who own their own companies. It doesn't have to be a Microsoft or an Apple. You could also take, a small business owner that has, for example, maybe a company in the US and then another company that they own in the UK or something like this. And you can say, well, because they have two operations outside Canada, they're considered multinational. So we can open up a third in Canada. And as the president CEO of the company, I can now import myself into that new branch in Canada and get a work permit and proceed to accumulate work experience and move my way forward into permanent residency along with my family and all that stuff as well. So these closed work permits that happen, they're not bad. They're actually very applicable and very good and very useful tools that companies and workers will be using to access our labor market and to fulfill labor needs, also to protect our labor market as well. Whereas the open work permits are kind of like beneficial work permits, that you get it as an account of being a spouse from someone else that's on a closed work permit, or you've undergone like an intense sort of, expensive study program, at the master's level, PhD level, and now you're going to get a work permit as a result of that, because the goal is to keep that type of labor in Canada, right? So if we've sort of grown, a student up to the bachelor level, we want to make sure they have a pathway to stay in Canada by allowing them to work so that possibly they could get permanent residency from that. So the moral of this story, if I want to summarize what I've been talking about today, the work permit situation in Canada. Some people are eligible just by who they are and where they come from for open work permits. Take the IEC program, for example. That's a good example of people who can get access to open work permits. And that's great. Like that's the easiest type of work permit there is, right? There's nothing to it really. And then, other people are going to need to go through a closed work permit system, which means they have to have a job offer in place, or they have to be in one of those categories that kind of moves them into the closed work permit space. And there's variations in between as well. You can have two things exist at the same time. You can have a study permit and a work permit. You can have a closed work permit and an open work permit. There's various things that happen when you come to Canada. Maybe you're working for employer A and then suddenly employer B offers you a new position with a better pay raise, and you can have multiple things happen. So the work permit situation in Canada, it is our stepping stone, or basically our first step into discovering a pathway to permanent residency. If you're interested in that opportunity, then you need to look at work before you get the permanent residency. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video, and be sure to look out for all the new content we're launching on YouTube. I want to get that subscription list up to 1,000 in the first 3 months. So be kind and give us a subscribe, and hopefully we'll see you next time. Drop me a comment. I'll be happy to answer. Thank you.